The winter of 1886 to 1887 killed 247 people across Dakota Territory. Three orphan sisters named Calloway were not among them. That fact alone would have been remarkable enough for a household of young women farming 65 acres of exposed prairie with no parents, no husband, no protection except what they could build with their own hands and whatever knowledge their father had left behind. But the fact itself is only the surface of the story. What lies underneath it, like everything that mattered that year, required going deeper than most people were willing to go. Ridgewood Valley in the autumn of 1886 was the kind of place that looked generous from a distance and revealed its hostility only after you had committed to it. And the valley ran roughly northwest to southeast along a shallow depression in the northern Dakota plain, wide enough that the far tree line was a dark smudge on most days, close enough on clear autumn mornings to seem almost inviting. There were no real hills to break the wind. There were no significant tree stands between the homesteads and the open country to the northwest, which was where every serious weather system came from. What there was instead was grass and sky, and about 150 families spread across 35,000 acres of government land, each one trying to solve the same fundamental problem: how to survive a climate that did not particularly care whether they did. The community that had grown up along the valley's main track consisted of a trading post run by a man named Graves, on a sawmill and carpentry operation belonging to Samuel Brennan, a small white clapboard church, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and a building that served as both post office and the office of the county extension agent, Mr. Crawford. The people who moved through these spaces knew one another the way people know each other in small isolated communities, completely and selectively, aware of every fact and missing almost everything that mattered. Elspeth Calloway was measuring firewood on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September when the shape of the coming winter first became clear to her, not in an abstract sense, in a specific, numerical, unambiguous sense that would not let her look away from it. She had been doing this for 20 minutes before a passing rider would have noticed her at all. And what the rider would have seen was a slender woman of 21 in a faded blue work dress moving along the side of the stacked wood with a length of knotted rope, checking measurements with the deliberate patience of someone who had learned the habit from a person who measured things for a living. Her hair was dark brown, almost black in certain light, pulled back and pinned in the practical way of a woman who did not think about her hair before 9 in the morning. Her hands were marked by 5 months of running a farm alone with her younger siblings. The skin thickened at the palms, the knuckles slightly raw from yesterday's washing. What the rider would not have seen, because it was not visible from the road, was the way her jaw had tightened in the last 3 minutes. And or the fact that she had stopped moving and was simply standing at the south end of the main stack, looking at the bottom layer. The bottom layer was wrong. She had known, in the way you know things before you are ready to face them, that the wood stacked against the barn's east wall had been sitting in its current position since before her father died. He had cut it the previous autumn, stacked it green in late October, and planned to let it season through the winter and into spring. The plan had made sense when there were 2 adults and an intact roof overhang covering the stack. What had happened instead was that the overhang over the east wall had developed a slow leak sometime in June, and the rain from 3 summer storms had worked its way down through the top layers and pooled along the ground contact at the bottom. She had known about the leak. She had patched it in July. She had not, until this morning, fully inventoried what the water had done in the weeks before she caught it. She pulled back a section of the bottom course with both hands. The wood came apart with the soft, crumbling resistance of rot. Not all of it, maybe a third of the bottom layer. She worked along the length of the stack for another 10 minutes, pulling and testing, setting aside what was salvageable, and stacking the ruined wood separately. When she was done, the pile of unusable wood stood at roughly a third of a cord. Copper, the 4-year-old border collie mix who had been watching from his usual spot near the barn door, walked over and sat beside her. His brown coat caught the morning light. His eyes moved between her face and the ruined wood pile with the focused attention of a dog who understood when something was wrong. Elspeth sat down on the salvage pile and did the arithmetic she had been doing in her head since she first felt the wood give under her hands. 4 cords had been the number her father had promised before he died. 4 cords was what she had planned around, what she had structured the coming winter's calculations against. The real number was 3.5. The difference between 4 chords and 3.5 chords did not sound like much until you set it against the other number. 7. 7 chords was the minimum a family of 3 needed to survive a normal Dakota winter in a well-sealed cabin running a cast-iron stove. Not a comfortable winter, a surviving winter. 3.5 was half of 7. She was not short by a little. She was short by exactly half. She sat on the salvage pile for a while without moving. A meadowlark somewhere behind the barn was running through its fall song, short and sharp, not the long summer melody. The sky above the valley was that specific shade of high September blue that looked warm and was not. She was not crying. She was not yet frightened. Or rather, she was frightened in the quiet, precise way of someone whose mind has moved past the emotional fact of the problem and into the problem itself. Her father would have sat down with a piece of paper. He would have drawn a line down the center, put the constraints on the left and the available tools on the right, and worked through it with the same methodical patience he brought to everything that involved numbers and materials and physical laws. She knew this because she had watched him do it dozens of times. In their first house in Pennsylvania before the move, in the early months at the homestead, on the evening after their first Dakota winter, when he sat by the stove and drew diagrams she only half understood until much later. Gareth Calloway had been a mining engineer, not a miner in the physical sense, not a man who swung a pick or worked the coalface. He was the person who figured out why a particular shaft was flooding when the others were not, who calculated the ventilation requirements for a new level, who identified the reason a timber support system was failing under pressures that the theoretical calculations said it should have withstood. He thought in terms of forces and flows, of heat and pressure, and the movement of air through confined spaces. She stood up and went inside to find a piece of paper. Copper followed her. Linnea was sitting at the kitchen table when Elspeth came through the door. At 18, she had the same dark hair as her older sister, but a narrower frame, a persistent pallor that deepened in cold weather, and the careful, measured breathing of someone whose lungs had never been entirely reliable. She looked up from the mending in her hands. She saw Elspeth's face. She set the mending down. Tobias was not in the house. At 16, he had been up since 5, handling the morning chores with the focused energy of a boy, trying to prove he could carry a man's weight. He would be back within the hour. Linnea waited. Elspeth sat down across from her and told her the number. 3.5 chords. Linnea was quiet for a long moment. Her hands stayed flat on the table. More and then she said very softly, "What are we going to do?" Elspeth pulled the worn leather journal from its place beneath the loose floorboard under the bedroom. Her father's handwriting filled page after page. Diagrams, calculations, notes from his years in the Cornish mines. She opened it to a section near the middle. She had read these pages before, many times in the months since his death, trying to hold on to whatever parts of him she could still touch. But she had read them as memory. Tonight she read them as instruction. Gareth Calloway had worked 15 years in the Dalcoath mine in Cornwall, England, one of the deepest mines in the world at that time, 550 feet below the surface at its lowest working levels. He had written about the temperature down there. Not hot, the way people imagine deep earth to be. Not cold either. Steady, reliable. Somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the surface was doing. In January, when the Cornish wind cut through every gap and every wall, the deep levels were 52 degrees. In August, when the surface baked under rare summer sun, the deep levels were 52 degrees. The earth stored energy. That was how he had explained it to Elspeth when she was 14 and asking why mines worked the way they did. The earth absorbed the warmth of summer slowly into its mass and released it so slowly that the winter never quite reached it. Below the frost line, everything was stable. She turned pages until she found the diagram she was looking for. Her father had sketched it on a corner of newspaper 3 years ago, showing how a passage dug below the frost line and connecting 2 structures would act as a heat exchanger. Air entering at one end would travel through earth temperature space and arrive at the other end, warmed or cooled to match. In winter, that meant air entering at 30 below zero would arrive at 50 degrees. He had never built one. He had talked about it as a thing that could be built, an application of principles he had seen demonstrated underground. She had filed it in the same mental category as several other things he had talked about building someday. The better smokehouse design, the root cellar with natural ventilation, things that required time and materials and a particular problem to solve before they justified their effort. She now had the particular problem. The door opened and Tobias came in, wind bringing cold air and the smell of hay and animal warmth. He saw his sisters at the table. He saw the journal. He saw Elspeth's face. He stood very still in the doorway. "What happened?" Elspeth told him. She told him about the rotted wood, about the 3.5 cords, about the 7 they needed. She told him about the passage. Tobias listened. His face went through several expressions, settling finally on something between disbelief and calculation. Then he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "This is insane." His voice was louder than he meant it to be. "You're talking about digging a tunnel, 65 feet, by yourself, based on something Father drew on a piece of newspaper 3 years ago. It's based on physics, Tobias, not imagination. Physics that nobody else in this valley has ever used. On a physics that the man who's built every house here says is wrong. And you want to bet our lives on it?" Linnea coughed, a deep, rattling sound that made both of them turn. When she could speak again, her voice was quiet but steady. "What choice do we have?" Tobias looked at his younger sister, at her pale face, at the careful way she breathed, at the winter that was coming for her lungs and would not be gentle. He did not answer. He walked out of the cabin and did not come back until after dark. That night, Elspeth sat at the table alone, working through the physics on paper the way her father had taught her. Frost line in Dakota, 4 to 5 feet. Below that depth, ground temperature holds at 50 to 55 degrees year-round. If she dug a covered passage from the cabin to the barn at 5 feet deep, the walls and floor of that passage would hold close to 52 degrees, even in the worst of winter. The passage would need to be ventilated. Her father had been very clear about the danger of still air in enclosed underground spaces. But if she positioned the intake at the barn end, the air entering would already be warmed by the body heat of the animals. 2 cows and a dozen chickens in an enclosed space generated significant and steady thermal output. The air inside the barn on a cold night was already 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. That pre-warmed barn air, drawn into the passage and then traveling 65 feet through underground space with 52-degree walls, would arrive at the cabin end at close to 52 degrees, regardless of what was happening above ground. She wrote the comparison. So stove lifting temperature from 52 degrees to 63 degrees versus stove lifting temperature from -42 to 63. The second case required the stove to do almost 10 times the work of the first. With 3.5 cords of wood, she could not survive the second case. She might survive the first. She sat with the paper for another hour, looking at the numbers from different angles, checking her reasoning against what she remembered of her father's explanations. She could not find the flaw. The next morning, she went to the floor beneath the bedroom and lifted the board that covered the shallow space where her father had kept their cash reserves in a tin box. She counted the contents twice. $98. It was everything. In the proceeds of 2 seasons of milk sales and the small amount her father had set aside from his last 2 contracts, $98 was not nothing on the frontier in 1886. It was also not a margin. It was the entire cushion between where she was and having nothing. She needed corrugated iron sheeting for the passage roof and rough-sawn timber for the internal framing. The iron for the roof, the timber for the A-frame supports that would keep the structure from collapsing under the earth as she would pile back on top. Gravel for drainage, hardware. There was a notice at the trading post about an Army surplus auction at Fort Lincoln. The list included corrugated iron sheeting and rough-saw timber. Fort Lincoln was a day's wagon drive to the southwest. She counted out $62 and held it in her hand for a long time. What more than half of everything? If she spent it and the passage failed, she would have nothing and still face the same winter. The thought was not abstract. She held the weight of it. The $62 went into a separate pocket. The remaining $36 went back into the tin. Before we continue, I want you to pause for just a moment. Elspeth Calloway has $36 left, a father's notebook, and 65 feet of frozen earth standing between her family and survival. Her brother has walked out in anger. Her sister's lungs are failing, and everyone in the valley is about to tell her she is wrong. If you were in her position, what would you do? Take a moment to think about that before we continue. The auction at Fort Lincoln was held in a cleared area behind the supply depot, surrounded with items arranged in rows, in a corporal with a ledger managing the bidding. There were perhaps 45 men present. As far as Elspeth could determine, no other women. The men looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity and the particular kind of performative disinterest that men sometimes used when they were in fact paying very close attention. She did not look back at them. She found the corrugated iron sheeting in the third row. Military gauge, slightly bent in places from storage and transport, but fundamentally sound. The rough timber was in the fifth row, a mixed lot of different dimensions, some of it genuinely rough saw, and some of it salvage from construction projects. She walked the rows twice before the auction started, calculating what she needed and in what quantities, much noting which lots were most likely to go cheap because they required someone with a specific purpose to find them useful. The bidding went as she had anticipated. She paid $58 for everything she needed, including additional timber that she had not strictly planned for, but recognized as worth acquiring at the price. The corporal helped her load the wagon. She tied the load down with 3 passes of rope, checked the tie-downs twice, and started back north before the auction crowd had fully dispersed. She drove through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping once to water the mule and eat the bread and dried apples she had packed that morning. The wagon was heavy and slow. The sky to the northwest had the beginning of a mackerel pattern that she had learned over 3 Dakota winters to read as the leading edge of a significant pressure change coming down from Canada. She thought about the 65 feet of trench she needed to dig, and the 6 weeks she estimated she had before the ground began to harden past the point of easy excavation. She arrived home after dark, unloaded what she could by lantern light, and slept. She started digging the following morning. The line she had marked with stakes and string ran 65 feet in a straight path from the northeast corner of the cabin, specifically from the small mudroom attached to the cabin's north wall, to the southeast corner of the barn, which was where the 2 cow stalls were positioned and where the ambient temperature would be highest in winter. She had walked the line 4 times and checked the grade twice with the level her father kept in his tool chest. There was a natural slight slope from the cabin end toward the barn, which was useful. She wanted any water that entered the passage to move toward the barn end and away from the cabin foundation. The first foot of digging was the easiest and the worst in a way. Easy because the topsoil was loose and came up quickly. Worse because it was easy, which meant that the rate she was working at in the first hour was not the rate she would be working at by the end of the first day. She had planned for a 6-inch gravel base, which meant she needed to excavate to 5 feet 6 inches, not simply 5 feet. The passage needed to be 4 feet wide and as close to 5 feet high as she could manage without compromising the structural integrity of the soil walls. Copper positioned himself at the edge of the trench that first morning and stayed there, watching her work with the patient attention he brought to everything she did. When she paused to drink water, he was there. When she climbed out to move the wheelbarrow, he followed alongside. When she went back down into the earth, he settled at the edge again, his brown eyes tracking her movements. On the 3rd day, she hit clay. Not immediately and not everywhere, but in a diagonal band running roughly across the middle of the planned trench. The substrate shifted from the sandy loam of the topsoil to a layer of dense pale clay mixed with water-smooth stones the size of her fist. The pickaxe, her father's good one with the 36-inch handle and a head that had been reset twice but was currently solid, worked in this material, but it worked slowly. She could feel the difference in her forearms by mid-morning and in her lower back by early afternoon. The physical demands of the work accumulated in ways she had anticipated and in ways she had not. Her hands developed blisters in the first week. Then the blisters hardened into calluses in the second. Then the calluses split at the edges in the third. She kept a piece of clean cotton rag in her apron pocket and wrapped her hands before picking up the tools each morning. Her lower back ached from the bent posture required to work at depth in a trench that was by design not quite tall enough to stand upright in. She had developed a strategy for this. Once she worked on her knees for the initial breaking of the clay, shifting to a standing position for the removal and loading of the loosened material. It was less efficient than a continuous standing position would have been, but it distributed the muscular load differently and allowed her to continue working when a standing-only approach would have forced her to stop. Harriet Pemberton was the first. She stopped her buggy at the edge of the property on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of digging. Her husband ran the general store in town, which made her one of the primary nodes in the valley's information network. She sat in the buggy for several minutes, watching Elspeth work. Then she drove on without speaking. By Saturday, the news had spread. The Callaway girl was digging some kind of hole. Nobody knew exactly what, but it was strange, and she was doing it alone. Harriet told Martha Henderson at the church social that Sunday, "Poor things, that father's death must have driven them right out of their minds. Building something out there in the dirt, digging like animals." The phrase caught on. By the end of the following week, people in town were referring to the construction as the grave, the Callaway grave, as if Elspeth were digging her own burial place. On the 8th day of digging, the cane handle of her father's pickaxe cracked. It did not break cleanly. It split longitudinally for about 8 inches from the point where the wood entered the head, and the split widened with each stroke until, on a downswing into the deepest clay section at the center of the trench, the handle separated completely. The head dropped into the earth at her feet. The upper part of the handle swung back against her shoulder with enough force to leave a bruise. She stood in the trench with 2 pieces of wood and looked at the pickaxe head lying in the clay. She had no replacement handle. She had no second pickaxe. The pick at the trading post was $8, which she had, barely, and every dollar remaining in the tin had a specific importance. She stood in the trench for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she climbed out, brushed the clay from her dress, and considered who she might borrow a tool from. Graves at the trading post heard her out politely and shook his head at the conclusion of her explanation, looking at his ledger as he spoke. The gesture of a man who wanted to communicate that the problem was not personal, but systemic. The Henderson farm was her second attempt. See, Elizabeth Henderson met her at the door with the particular expression of a woman who wanted to help but was not going to. "We need ours," she said. "I'm sorry." She did not sound sorry. Josiah Oakes was her third stop. Oakes was 50 years old, a man who had come to Dakota Territory from Ohio a decade prior, and who had the physical build and the conversational style of someone who had spent years working primarily alone. He was not unfriendly. He was efficient with words in the way that people become efficient with things they do not consider decorative. He listened to Elspeth's request from the doorway of his equipment shed without expression, his eyes moving over her face in the direct, evaluative way of someone making a practical assessment rather than a social one. "Nah, what are you building?" Not the polite version of the question that people had been asking her for 2 weeks with its subtext of concern and skepticism. A direct request for information. She told him, briefly, technically, the passage, the depth, the purpose. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he walked into the shed and came back with a pickaxe older than her father's. The handle worn smooth at the grip from years of use, but solid. He held it out. "Keep it until spring," he paused. "If you're still here." It was not cruelty. It was the plainest possible acknowledgement of the situation she was actually in, which was more respectful, in a particular way, than the careful evasions she had been getting from everyone else. She took the pickaxe, thanked him, and drove back to the farm. The digging resumed that afternoon. Samuel Brennan stopped his wagon on a Friday afternoon in the second week of digging. He was returning from a delivery run to the south end of the valley and had, from a quarter-mile away, noticed the raw earth piled in long ridges alongside the Callaway cabin. He slowed his horses out of the particular combination of professional curiosity and social obligation that defined most of his interactions with his neighbors. Brennan was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that had not softened much in his 50s. He had been building in Dakota Territory for 22 years and was the closest thing the valley had to a structural authority. Not officially, practically, in the way that competence accumulates a reputation over time. He had built the church. He had built the schoolhouse. He had built 42 of the roughly 60 frame structures in the county. He knew every variation of soil condition and frost behavior and snow load and drainage problem that the territory could produce, because he had encountered them all in the work. He tied the reins and stepped down from the wagon and walked to the edge of the trench with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who expected that his opinion would be welcome. The trench was by that point roughly 40 feet long and approaching 4 feet in depth at its deepest section. The gravel was visible in one completed section near the cabin end. The framing lumber was stacked nearby, protected under an oilcloth. Brennan removed his hat, a habitual gesture that he probably thought conveyed respect, and that conveyed instead a kind of performed courtesy, or the etiquette of a man who knew he was about to deliver a verdict. "Miss Calloway." His voice had the round, caring quality of a man used to being the loudest and most authoritative voice on a job site. "I've been building in this territory since before you arrived. I know the soil here. I know the melt patterns." Elspeth stood in the trench with the pickaxe at rest, looking up at him. She waited. "Come spring, every ounce of snow on that mound is going to melt, and the water is going to follow the path of least resistance, which is straight down the sides and into that trench. You'll have a river running under your cabin foundation. You'll rot the sills. You'll undermine the footings." He paused, looked at the framing lumber. "I'm not trying to give you trouble. I've seen what I've seen over 22 years. And what you're building here is a mud trap." She thought of the gravel beds she had already laid in the completed section, 6 inches of coarse drainage gravel along the entire floor length. She thought of the slight but deliberate grade built into her excavation line, directing water toward the lower barn end rather than toward the cabin foundation. She thought about explaining these things to him and considered the specific kind of conversation that would result. A conversation that would require her to justify herself to a man who had already concluded his judgment. She decided the conversation was not worth having. "I've made arrangements for the water, Mr. Brennan, but I appreciate your concern." Her voice was level. He put his hat back on with the slow deliberateness of a man filing away a verdict that he intended to revisit. "And there's a right way and a wrong way to deal with this land. I hope for your family's sake this isn't the latter." He climbed back into his wagon and drove on. Before he reached the trading post, he had told 3 people about the Calloway orphans digging themselves a mud trap out on the north end of the valley. Elspeth went back to digging. On the 12th day, Tobias found her at the bottom of the trench. Not unconscious, but close. She had been working since before dawn, skipping breakfast, pushing through the lightheadedness that had been building for hours because there was so much work left and so little time. Her body had made the decision for her. She had sat down at the 42-foot mark, her back against the clay wall, her hands still wrapped around the pickaxe handle, unable to stand back up. Tobias had been coming to tell her lunch was ready. He stood at the edge of the trench and looked down at his sister, sitting motionless in the earth. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he climbed down. He took the pickaxe from her hands. He helped her stand. He did not say anything about the weeks of anger, about the argument in the kitchen, about walking out and not coming back until after dark. He looked at the walls of earth she had moved by herself. 42 feet, alone, while he had been telling himself this was her foolish idea and he would have no part of it. She had been down here, moving earth, building something that might save all their lives, while he did nothing. "Show me what to do." His voice was quiet. Elspeth looked at him. "I still don't know if this will work," he said. But I'm not going to let you do it alone." That afternoon, for the first time since the digging began, Elspeth was not alone in the trench. Tobias worked beside her until dark. He did not apologize for the weeks of silence. He did not explain himself. He simply worked. And Elspeth understood that this was the apology, the only one she would get, and the only one she needed. Dr. Fenimore Holt arrived on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of construction. He was the valley's physician, a man of 48 with the particular manner of someone who had studied at actual medical schools and wanted everyone to know it. He had heard about the Calloway construction from Brennan and had decided to offer his professional assessment. He walked the length of the partially completed trench with his hands clasped behind his back, making small sounds of disapproval. "Miss Calloway, I must tell you that from an engineering perspective, this structure is deeply problematic. The soil compression ratios alone suggest inevitable collapse. The clay substrate is unstable. And the concept itself, this idea of underground warming, it defies established thermal principles. Elspeth continued hammering a support beam into place. With respect, Dr. Holt, the principles aren't theoretical. They've been demonstrated in mines for centuries. Mines have professional engineers, support systems, ventilation equipment. Mines also have temperatures of 52 degrees at 500 feet when it's zero above. The principle is the same whether you have professional engineers or not. Holt's expression tightened. Atron, I'm simply trying to prevent a tragedy. I appreciate that. She drove another nail. Come back in January. Bring a thermometer. Reverend Aldous Crane came next. He was 60 years old, white-haired, with the measured cadence of a man who had been delivering sermons for 40 years and had learned to make every word sound significant. He did not examine the construction, he examined Elspeth. My child, I've heard about what you're building here, and I must confess some concern. Concern about what, Reverend? About whether this is natural, whether you're trying to circumvent God's design for how we should live in this land. Elspeth stopped working. She looked at him directly. Reverend Crane, my father taught me that God gave us minds so we could solve problems. That understanding how the earth works isn't defying God's design. It's appreciating it. She gestured at the trench. The earth holds warmth. That's not magic. That's how God made it. I'm just using what's already there. The Reverend did not look convinced, but he did not argue further. Old Ezra Whitfield came on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 72 years old, a former miner who had worked the Comstock lode in Nevada in his younger days, and who now lived alone in a small cabin at the south end of the valley. He walked the full length of the trench without speaking. He examined the framing. He looked at the gravel drainage. He spent a long time studying the point where the passage would connect to the cabin. Then he turned to Elspeth. I worked 1,500 feet down in the Comstock. Hot as hell down there, but stable. Same temperature every day regardless of what the surface was doing. He nodded slowly. You know what you're doing. The physics is sound. He looked toward town. They don't understand because they've never been deep enough to feel it. But you're right, and they're wrong. He walked away without waiting for a response. Elspeth watched him go. It was the first validation she had received from anyone in the valley. It would be the last for a long time. The news that reached Elspeth through Cordelia Ashford came on a gray afternoon in late October. Cordelia was the wife of the minister's assistant. She had driven out to the farm on the pretense of bringing preserves. She stood in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and delivered the information in the low, urgent voice of someone sharing intelligence that could not be traced back to her. Someone filed a formal complaint with the county about the living conditions here, about whether Linnea and Tobias are being properly cared for. Elspeth set down the pot she had been holding. Who filed it? I don't know for certain, but Cordelia hesitated. Thaddeus Holden was at the county office the day before the complaint appeared. He was asking questions about land transfers, about what happens to property when families can't maintain it. She did not say more. She did not need to. Thaddeus Holden owned the largest ranch in the valley. He had made his interest in the Calloway property clear within weeks of Gareth Calloway's death. He had approached Elspeth twice with offers to buy the land, at prices calculated to seem generous to someone desperate. She had declined both times. He had not made a third offer, but he had also not stopped watching. Mr. Crawford is going to come investigate, Cordelia continued, and if he decides the conditions aren't adequate. She did not finish the sentence. If Crawford decided the conditions were inadequate, Linnea and Tobias could be removed and placed in the county orphan home until spring, or longer. Everything Elspeth had been building would be meaningless. When is he coming? Sometime in the next few weeks, before the worst weather. Cordelia put her hand on Elspeth's arm. I'm sorry, I thought you should know. After she left, Elspeth stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. Copper pressed against her leg, sensing the distress. She put her hand on his head. We have to finish, she said, to herself, to the dog, to whatever force governed whether effort resulted in salvation or failure. We have to finish, and then we have to prove it works. By the end of October, the passage was complete, 65 feet long, 5 feet deep, 4 feet wide, 5 feet high at the center. The gravel bed ran the full length, 6 inches deep and compacted with a drainage grade consistent throughout. The A-frame timber framing had gone in over 2 days. The rough saw lumber fitted into triangular supports at 18-inch intervals along the full length of the passage, creating a structural arch that would distribute the weight of the earth above it along its sides rather than collapsing under vertical pressure. The corrugated iron went on over the frame in overlapping sheets, each sheet lapping over the previous by a minimum of 3 inches to prevent water infiltration at the seams. She had driven the fastening nails with particular care at the overlaps, checking each joint by hand before moving on. The ventilation intake at the barn end was a length of iron pipe 3 inches in diameter, fitted with a simple baffle arrangement that her father had described to her once in the context of mine ventilation, a design that allowed air movement but prevented direct wind penetration, which would have destroyed the thermal benefit of the pre-warming effect. The pipe drew from inside the barn itself, from the warm space above the cow stalls where the animal's body heat accumulated. The earth went back over the iron in 2 stages. At first, the excavated material she had been piling in berms alongside the trench for 6 weeks, shoveled back on in layers and tamped down. Then additional soil from the berm tops, building up a crown mound over the full length of the passage to a depth of at least 2 feet at the crown. When the mound was complete and the doors fitted at each end, one into the cabin mudroom and one into the barn corner, both built from doubled boards with straw packed between, she walked its full length from above, checking for low spots where water might pool, checking for signs of settlement. Everything held. The total cost of materials when she tallied the receipts was $62. She had $4 left, and a passage connecting her cabin to her barn covered in 2 feet of packed earth, when running 65 feet through soil that the winter could not reach. Copper ran the length of the mound twice, his tail wagging, as if he understood that something important had been accomplished. Tobias stood at the cabin end of the passage and looked down its length. "Does it feel warmer to you? In there?" Elspeth nodded. "It will feel warmer all winter. That's the point. Pause here with me for a moment. The passage is complete. Elspeth has $4 left to her name. Every person of authority in the valley has told her she is wrong, that she is building a mud trap, that she is digging her own grave. Someone has filed a complaint that could take her brother and sister away from her. The only question left is, who is right? What do you think will happen? Think about that before we continue." November in Ridgewood Valley arrived not with a single dramatic drop, but with a series of incremental withdrawals. The morning temperatures fell by 2 or 3 degrees every few days. The light shortened perceptibly from one week to the next. The grass on the mound over the passage went from dry brown to frost white and stayed there. The ground around the mound hardened. The creek at the valley's low edge developed a skim of clear ice by mid-month that thickened daily. The sky acquired the particular flat gray quality that longtime Dakota residents recognized as the territory settling into its winter posture, drawing in, preparing for what it intended to do for the next 4 months. Inside the cabin, something had changed. It was not dramatic. There was no single morning when Elspeth woke and noticed a transformation. What there was instead was an accumulation of small different facts. The walls on the north side, which in previous winters had sweated moisture on cold nights as warm interior air met the chilled surface, stayed dry. The floor, which had always been the coldest surface in the room, losing its battle against the frost that worked up through the foundation from below, remained merely cool rather than near freezing. The stove, which she had always run at close to its maximum capacity from the first hard frost onward, ran at perhaps 2/3 of that rate and held the room at a temperature she had not reliably seen since October. She kept a log in a small notebook. Her father's habit, which she had adopted with deliberate intention from the first day she lit the stove. Every morning she recorded the outside temperature from the thermometer mounted on the barn's exterior east wall, sheltered from direct wind. She recorded the inside temperature from the thermometer on the cabin's interior east wall. And she recorded in the evening the amount of wood she had added to the stove that day, using the fractional cord measurements her father had taught her. By the 20th of November, the pattern in the log was clear. Outside temperature averaging 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature holding at 58 to 60 degrees. Daily wood consumption approximately 1/40th of a cord. The mathematics projected forward into a monthly total that she checked 3 times because it seemed too favorable to accept without verification. 3/4 of a cord per month, in conditions that her previous experience told her should require at least 2 cords. The passage was working. The air moving through it arrived at the cabin end, warmer than the outside air by a margin of close to 18 degrees on an average morning. The stove was not fighting Dakota winter. The stove was making a minor adjustment to air that the Earth had already mostly dealt with. It was a quiet and invisible revolution happening below the surface of her ordinary days. What was not quiet and not invisible was what the valley was continuing to say about her. Brennan's verdict had spread through the trading post and the sawmill in his capacity as the territory's principal structural authority. His verdict had been the kind that sticks, not because it was harsh, but because it was specific and technical and came from a man who had been right about structural matters many times before. The mud trap assessment, the water infiltration argument, these were not gossip in the simple sense. They were professional opinions delivered in a social context, which made them more durable than ordinary rumors, because they had the form of factual claims. Silas Thorne, a young man of 24 who worked odd jobs around the valley and who had appointed himself the voice of popular opinion, had taken to calling the construction the Callaway Tomb in public settings. "Those crazy Callaway sisters," he announced at the Trading Post one afternoon, loud enough for everyone present to hear. "Building themselves a mole hole, digging their own graves before they're even dead." He laughed at his own joke. Several people laughed with him. Thaddeus Holden said nothing at all when this happened, but his silence had a quality to it, the quality of a man waiting for a prediction to come true. The night of December 18th was not the coldest night of the winter. That distinction would belong to the blizzard still weeks ahead, but it was the first serious test. Temperature falling to 38 below zero. Wind building from the northwest to 30 miles per hour by midnight. The kind of wind that made the land itself seem hostile rather than merely cold. Elspeth woke at 2 in the morning with the instinctive alertness of someone whose sleeping mind had registered a change before the waking mind could name it. She lay still for a moment listening. The stove was not the issue. She could hear from its particular sound that it was burning at the right rate. The cabin walls were not the issue. What she was hearing, or rather what she was not hearing, was the specific low tone of the passage intake, the almost inaudible frequency of air moving through the intake pipe at the barn end, a sound she had become attuned to over the past 6 weeks of living with it. The way you become attuned to the sounds of a house's functioning until their absence is louder than their presence. She pulled on her work dress and boots and took the lantern to the mudroom. She opened the passage door and stepped into the tunnel. The warmth was there, the deep, constant 52-degree warmth of the earth that the passage generated reliably every hour of every day. But at the far end of the passage, where the gravel floor met the barnside door, there was something that should not be there. Air, moving air, cold air, working in through a gap that was not a design gap. She held the lantern up and walked the passage its full length, checking the ceiling. In the middle section, roughly 30 feet from either end, she found it. One of the corrugated iron sheets had lifted at its downhill edge by perhaps 4 inches, the result of frost heave in the soil above it, working against the fastening nails at the overlap joint. The gap was small in the context of the full passage. 4 inches of infiltration in one section was not immediately catastrophic, but cold air was moving through it. Cold air was already beginning to work against the thermal mass that the surrounding earth had spent 6 weeks building up. If she sealed it now, the damage could be contained. If she left it through the night, the cold air would begin to cool the earth walls at that section, and the cooling would spread through the thermal mass. And by morning, the pre-warming effect of the full passage would be compromised in ways that would take days to restore. She stood in the passage with the lantern and the cold air against her face and understood with precise clarity that there was no option in which this problem solved itself. Brennan's specific concern, frost heave at the seams, had manifested in a reduced and manageable form. She had built the drainage correctly. She had built the framing correctly. She had not built the fastening intervals at the iron overlaps with sufficient resistance to the kind of frost heave that 38 below zero produced on its first serious night. The problem required her to go outside in the current conditions and fasten the lifted section back against the framing timber below it, from above, which meant accessing the mound surface in a storm that was currently operating at conditions where unprotected skin could sustain damage within minutes. If she did not do it tonight, by morning everything she had built would begin to fail. She went back to the mudroom and stood very still for a moment, making the inventory that needed to be made. Tobias and Linnea were asleep. She had perhaps 3 hours before dawn. The work at the repair point would take 15 minutes if she could find the joint in the dark and if the nails went in cleanly. Getting to the point and back would add perhaps 10 minutes in each direction, navigating the mound surface in zero visibility. She had rope. She had nails, 4 of them, kept in the tool chest against the possibility of exactly this kind of repair. She had the hammer. She had 3 layers of clothing and her heavy coat and the wool scarf and her thick knitted work gloves, and inside those her thinner cotton gloves. What she did not have was the option of waiting until morning. She dressed. She tied the rope to the post inside the mudroom door, using her father's knotwork, the cleat hitch he had shown her 3 times because she kept forgetting. She looped the other end through her belt. She put the repair nails in her coat pocket, 4 of them, and checked the count twice. She took the hammer in her right hand. Copper stood at the door, whining softly. "Stay," she told him. "I'll be back." She opened the mudroom door. The cold was physical in the way a wall is physical. Not simply low temperature, but pressure. The wind carrying the 38 below air as a force rather than a condition. Working against her face and chest. Finding every insufficient closure in her clothing with the efficiency of something that did not need to try. She moved along the rope, keeping it taut in her left hand, navigating by the line of the mound edge below her feet rather than by sight, which was useless. The lantern would have been extinguished within 30 seconds out here. She needed both hands. She found the gap by the cold air working out of it. Crouched over the mound surface in the wind in the dark, she could feel the specific temperature differential where the unsealed joint was releasing the tunnel's warmth into the storm. She ran her gloved fingers along the iron edge until she found the lifted section. When she pressed it down against the timber below it, holding it flat with her left palm, while she drove the first nail with her right. The hammer swings were short and controlled. She could not afford a missed strike in the dark. Not with nails she had counted and could not replace out here. First nail, second nail. She changed the pressure of her palm, repositioning to drive the third nail at the opposite corner of the lifted section. Third nail. The iron was flat against the timber now. Holding. Fourth nail. Center span. Insurance. She stayed over the repair for an additional 30 seconds with her palm flat on the iron, feeling through the glove for any further movement. Nothing. The section was sealed. The cold air coming through her from all directions had by this point worked its way into her collar and her cuffs and the gap between her boot tops and her trouser legs. The fingers of her right hand, the hand that had been gripping the hammer, had lost their individual sensation and were operating as a unit. She found the rope and followed it back. Inside the mudroom with the door closed, she stood without moving for a moment while the heat from the passage began to work against the cold she had brought in with her. The fingers of her right hand burned as sensation returned to them. The specific burning of tissue coming back from the edge of real damage. Not frostbite. Close to it, but not there. She flexed them until the burning settled into ordinary feeling, checked each finger by moving it deliberately, then took off the outer gloves and held her hands near the passage intake where the 52-degree air came through. Copper had been waiting at the inner door. He pressed against her legs when she came through, whimpering softly, licking at her cold hands. "I'm all right," she told him. "I'm all right." She went back to bed at 2:40 in the morning. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm work against the cabin's exterior and felt the particular quality of the air in the room. 59 degrees. Steady. Unaffected by what was happening 30 feet above the frost line. By morning, the temperature outside had fallen to 41 below. The passage intake was running at its normal frequency. The interior of the cabin, when she checked the thermometer at 5:30, read 60 degrees. The repair had held. But she had used 4 of the 8 nails she had kept in reserve. And the winter was not halfway done. And the blizzard that would determine everything was still weeks away. Take a moment here. 4 nails, in complete darkness, at 38 below zero. No room for error. Elspeth Calloway went out into conditions that kill, alone, because that was what the situation required. Sometimes survival is not about dramatic heroics. Sometimes it is about doing the necessary thing in the necessary moment, regardless of the cost. Remember that as we continue. The last days of December moved through Ridgewood Valley with a grinding, methodical severity that was different in character from the storms that had preceded them. There were no dramatic temperature events in that final week of the year. No single night that broke records or produced the kind of specific catastrophe that entered community memory as a named event. What there was instead was duration. Cold that arrived and did not leave. Cold that, unlike the sharp plunges of mid-December, did not relent into the 10 below zero range that now felt, by comparison to what had come before it, almost moderate. The overnight lows of the last week of December held at 25 to 32 below zero, with the unvarying patience of something that had decided to stay. The valley's homesteads responded to duration differently than they responded to acute events. An acute event produced specific disasters. The chimney fire, the frozen water bucket, the cattle lost in a single terrible night. Mid-duration produced a slower deterioration that was harder to name and harder to fight because it had no single point of failure. It was the 8th cord of wood burning when the winter supply had been calculated for 7. It was the temperature in the main room dropping from 48 degrees to 45 degrees and staying there despite the stove running at the same rate it had run the week before. Because the thermal mass of the walls had been losing ground incrementally for 3 weeks and could no longer maintain the equilibrium it had managed in November. It was the bodies of the family adapting to the cold, sleeping in more clothing, moving less during the coldest hours, gathering into the smallest and most heatable space in the house, which felt like management but was actually capitulation. Brennan felt this in his own house. He had built his home in 1877, 9 years prior, and had updated it twice since. Added window glazing, rebuilt the chimney with a better draw design, rechinked the exterior walls. It was the best constructed private residence in the valley by any objective measure, and he knew this with the comfortable authority of a man who had built every other structure it might be compared against. In normal winters, it was a point of professional satisfaction. In this one, it had become a source of private discomfort, because normal winters were not this winter, and the difference between what his house should have been doing and what it was actually doing was a gap he could not explain away with construction terms. His wood consumption for December was 2.5 cords. His main room had held 55 degrees on the best days, and the second floor, which he had never had to abandon in previous winters, was closed off with a blanket over the stairwell door because the heat did not reach it in sufficient quantity to make the rooms livable. His wife had moved her sewing to the main room. His 2 daughters had been sleeping together in the downstairs bedroom for 3 weeks. This was a family making adjustments that the house was supposed to make unnecessary, and Brennan was aware of this fact in the precise and uncomfortable way of a craftsman confronting the limits of his craft. He had driven past the Calloway property on 3 separate occasions during the last 10 days of December, each time with a delivery or an errand that legitimately took him along the north track. Each time he had looked at the cabin with the professional assessment he could not turn off. Wash windows clear of frost, door frame without ice buildup, the chimney smoke rising in a thin, easy column, pale gray and undramatic, not the roaring dark plume that every other chimney in the valley was producing, a thin, easy column, like a cabin that was not fighting for its life. He had not stopped. He had driven past and kept the observation to himself, fitting it into the space in his mind where he kept things he had not yet found the framework to interpret. The storm came on the 12th of January, 1887. It did not arrive as a storm in the recognizable sense. It arrived as a transformation. At 6:15 in the morning, the temperature was 18 below zero and falling. At 7 o'clock, it was 29 below. By 8:30, it was 42 below zero. And a wind had materialized out of the northwest with the sudden violence of something that had been withheld and released. 55 miles per hour, gusting higher, driving the fine crystalline snow that the previous weeks had deposited across every open surface into a moving white wall that reduced visibility to the distance of an extended arm. The temperature drop of more than 40 degrees in under 3 hours was not a storm in the meteorological sense. It was a qualitative change in the nature of the air itself. It caught the valley in the middle of its ordinary morning activities. Farm hands had already gone out to morning chores. People were in transit between buildings, between homesteads, between the places they had been and the places they needed to be when the white wall arrived and the temperature fell off the edge of what the body could manage in unprotected exposure. Survival in those conditions was measured in feet, not miles. A person who could see the building they needed to reach but could not feel their hands was already in the territory where the margin between reaching it and not reaching it was narrower than it appeared. 12 people in Ridgewood Valley would not survive the next 9 days, 247 across Dakota Territory. Elspeth Calloway was inside when the storm hit. She had been up since 4:30, checking the passage, monitoring the stove, recording the overnight temperatures in her log. When the wind struck the cabin at 7:30, she went to her window and watched the visibility collapse. She understood within 30 seconds what she was looking at. She also understood, in the same 30 seconds, that there was nothing she could do about anyone but her own family. The world outside the window had become a white absence. The world inside the cabin remained what it had been. 59 degrees, quiet, stable. On the 5th day of the storm, Samuel Brennan loaded half a cord of his best seasoned oak onto his sleigh. The wood he had been holding back for his own household because it burned clean and long and hot. Because in these conditions, clean, long, hot wood was not a preference, but a survival variable. He hitched his 2 strongest horses, the match bays he had paid serious money for, because he made long winter deliveries and needed animals that could work in cold weather without losing their nerve. His wife came to the barn door and watched him without speaking, which was her way of asking what he was doing. He told her he was making a delivery run, because there were people in the valley who were out of wood or close to it, and the storm had arrived faster than anyone had prepared for. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth included the fact that his first stop, a stop he had decided on before he had consciously acknowledged making the decision, was the Calloway property. He told himself this was because she was the most vulnerable. A young woman alone with her siblings, limited resources, a construction that he had publicly judged as inadequate. He told himself he owed it to his conscience as a neighbor to check on the most at-risk household first. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. He finished hitching the horses and drove out into the white. The 400 yards from the main track to the Calloway cabin took 25 minutes in conditions where he could see the horses in front of him and nothing beyond. He navigated by the fence line, keeping the left wheel close to the post line. He stopped at the gate by memory more than sight. He tied the horses to the fence with the quick, practiced efficiency of a man who knew that animals left standing in these conditions needed to be facing away from the wind and needed to be moving again soon. He pulled the half cord of wood from the sleigh bed and stacked it against the fence in 2 armloads. He would bring it to the door if she needed it, if the situation inside was what he expected it to be. He reached the cabin door and knocked with his fist rather than his knuckles, because his knuckles had stopped communicating clearly with his nervous system sometime in the last 100 yards. He knocked twice, then a third time, louder, leaning close to the door and calling her name against the storm's noise. The door opened. What came out was warmth, not the conceptual warmth of a heated space, not the abstract fact of higher air temperature that you register as data. This was warmth as a physical event, a wall of it pressing outward through the doorframe into the Arctic air. With the force and character of a different season, it was the warmth of something that had been building steadily for weeks in a space that had been consistently, reliably, unhurriedly maintaining it. And it hit Brennan in the face and chest with the quality of something he did not have a ready name for. Until his mind, working slowly in the cold, produced the word May. It was the warmth of a May afternoon pressing out through a January doorframe in the middle of a blizzard that was killing the exposed. Elspeth stood in the opening wearing a wool dress and a kitchen apron. Her hair was pinned up in the working arrangement she wore when she was occupied with tasks around the house. She was not wearing a coat. She was not wearing gloves or a shawl or any of the additional garments that every other person in the valley was wearing inside their homes on this particular morning. She looked at him with the calm attention of someone who had not been in any emergency. "Mr. Brennan, you should not be out in this." He stood in the door frame with the blizzard pressing at his back and looked past her into the room. The stove in the corner was burning. He could see the faint glow through the draft vents. But it was not burning in the roaring, door-hot way that a stove needed to burn in these conditions to maintain any reasonable temperature. It was burning quietly, steadily, the way a stove burns when it is maintaining rather than recovering, when the room it is heating has not lost the warmth it is trying to keep. At the table in the center of the room, Tobias and Linnea were doing their schoolwork. Tobias had a reader open, his finger tracking across the page. Linnea was working with her slate, and making careful, deliberate marks. They both glanced up when the door opened, then returned to their work. They were wearing cotton shirts, not their winter undergarments, not the heavy wool that every person in the valley wore as a baseline from November through March. Cotton work shirts, the kind worn in September or April. Brennan looked at this for several seconds before the fact of it fully registered. The Calloway siblings were doing their schoolwork in cotton shirts on the morning of January 12, 1887. While outside the door, the wind chill was somewhere between 70 and 80 degrees below zero. Copper was lying beside the stove, his tail beginning to wag as he recognized a visitor. Brennan stepped inside. Elspeth closed the door. The quiet was as immediate as the warmth had been. The storm reduced from a physical roar to a muffled background presence, the sound of something happening at a distance rather than something happening to you. His beard, which had accumulated ice in the transit from the sleigh, began to melt and drip onto the collar of his coat. He became aware that he was shaking, not from cold exactly, but from the sudden removal of the physical effort of resisting cold, his body releasing the tension it had been holding for the last 25 minutes. He looked at the wall thermometer. He had installed it himself 4 years prior, driving the mounting screws into the log on a warm June afternoon when the Calloway edition was complete. He had installed the same model in every house he had built for the past decade, because he believed that knowing the temperature inside your house was as fundamental as knowing the temperature outside it. The glass was faintly filmed with interior condensation. He pulled off his right glove and wiped it with the back of his hand. The mercury stood at 63 degrees Fahrenheit. He read it twice. He stood in front of it for what felt like a long time, his right hand still raised from wiping the glass, and he read the number a third time. His mind did the thing that minds trained in measurement do automatically when confronted with a number that exceeds expectation. It checked for error, calibration drift, proximity to a heat source that might inflate the local reading. The thermometer was on the east wall, away from the stove. In the standard installation position that represented the ambient air temperature of the room, rather than the radiant temperature near the heating source, there was no error. Outside, the temperature at that moment was somewhere between 40 and 43 degrees below zero. The wind chill rendered that figure purely academic. What it meant to a person exposed to it was not a number but a timeline measured in minutes. The differential between the interior of this cabin and the exterior air was over 100 degrees, and the stove in the corner was burning quietly at a rate that Brennan, who had spent 22 years calibrating the relationship between stove operation and wood consumption, recognized as approximately 1/3 of its maximum capacity. He lowered his hand. He turned from the thermometer and looked at the room again. This time not as a neighbor who had expected to find an emergency, but as a builder looking at a thermal system. He touched the north wall, the wall most exposed to the prevailing winter wind, the wall that in every other house in the valley was the first to show frost penetration and moisture condensation. It was cool under his palm, not cold, cool. The way a well-insulated surface is cool, indifferent to the conditions outside it rather than conducting them inward. The architecture was the same cabin he had helped build 4 years ago. The stove was the same cast iron model that 30 other households in the valley were running at full capacity tonight to hold temperatures 15 to 20 degrees lower than this. The logs were the same species. The chinking was the same mix. Nothing about the structure he was standing in explained the number on the thermometer. The explanation was below ground, 65 feet of it, running beneath the mound of frozen earth that he had publicly called a mud trap on an October afternoon that now seemed to belong to a different chapter of his professional life. He turned back to Elspeth, who had not moved from her position near the door. She was watching him with the patient attention of someone who understood exactly what he was processing and had decided to let him process it without assistance. "I brought wood." His voice came out rougher than he intended. I thought you might be in need. Come sit down." She moved to the small table near the stove and took the kettle from its hook. "You've been out in that for long enough?" He sat. He put his hands around the cup she set in front of him and felt the heat move through his palms with the directness of something his body had been waiting for. Linnea looked up from her slate, examined him with the frank assessment of a young woman who had seen enough of men's assumptions to know when one was being revised, and returned to her letters. Tobias had not looked up again. He was reading with the absorbed focus of a student who had been given uninterrupted time and was using it. Brennan looked at those two young people, and then back at the thermometer on the wall, and then at Elspeth, who had sat down across the table with her own cup and was waiting with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for a long time and had learned how to do it without agitation. "How much wood?" The question came out almost quietly, not the booming carry of his professional voice. "Per month. 3/4 of a cord." She delivered the number without emphasis, which was itself a kind of emphasis. "Since November. Through last night." He sat with that figure. He had the other figures in his head. He had been carrying them for 2 weeks, comparing and recomparing, trying to find the interpretation that made the Callaway cabin's behavior consistent with what he knew to be possible. The Holden Ranch, 2 cords per month, 42 degrees. His own house, 2.5 cords, 55 in the main room on a good day. 3/4 of a cord producing 63 degrees in a structure with no better construction than what he had seen across the valley was not a variant result. It was a different category of result entirely. It was not better performance within the same system. It was evidence that the system itself was something he had not built before and did not yet fully understand. He was quiet for what felt to him like a long time. Elspeth did not fill the silence. "Explain it to me." He was not asking as a professional skeptic mounting a challenge. He was asking as a man who had built things for 22 years and understood that the most important moments in that work were the ones when you encountered something that required you to revise the principles you were working from. All of it. Start from the beginning. So she explained it, not in the careful teaching way she might have explained it to a child, but in the technical language of someone speaking to another builder. She watched Brennan's face as she spoke. She watched the resistance give way to recognition, the recognition give way to understanding, the understanding give way to something that looked almost like grief. The grief of a man realizing how much he had missed by not asking the right question. When she finished, he did not argue. He did not ask for proof. He asked to see her log. She put it in front of him, and he went through the November and December pages with the deliberate attention of a man reading a technical document rather than a narrative, noting the consistency of the data, the absence of anomalous entries, the way the outside temperature and the inside temperature correlated across 60 days without the relationship between them ever reflecting the kind of acute fuel expenditure that would indicate a heating system working at its limits. The drainage. He said it without looking up from the notebook. 6-inch gravel bed, full length, grade toward the barn end. The frost heave? Opened one seam in December. The middle section, about 4 inches of lift at an overlap joint. She told him what she had done about it. He looked up when she described the repair, and something moved through his expression that she might have recognized as professional respect if it had not been entangled with several other things. In those conditions, not a question, an acknowledgement. She turned her cup in her hands. It needed doing. He looked back at the notebook, turned the last page, set it down on the table with the care of someone handling something that had become, in the course of 20 minutes, a more significant document than it appeared. He took from the inside pocket of his coat, the pocket that held the things he carried every day as working materials, a folded piece of paper. Not fresh paper, something that had been folded and unfolded several times, that had the softened texture of a document handled with regular attention. He unfolded it on the table between them. It was a house plan. She could see that from across the table. The penciled elevation, the floor plan grid, the dimension notations in his neat draftsman's hand, a substantial structure, 2 stories, the kind of design that represented genuine ambition, the house he intended to build for his family the following spring, when the ground thawed and the lumber could be brought in. He had mentioned it at church in October before the winter as his project for the coming year. She had heard this the way you hear announcements of future plans in October, as a normal forward-looking statement from a man with resources and intentions. He looked at the plan for a long moment. His expression had the quality of someone conducting an internal argument that he had already resolved but needed to enact for it to be real. Then he took the plan in both hands and tore it in half along the centerfold. He put the 2 halves together and tore them again into quarters. He held the pieces for a moment and then set them on the corner of the table. "I've been building the wrong thing." His voice was not dramatic. It was tired and precise, the voice of a man stating a conclusion that cost something to state. For 22 years, the right materials, the right joinery, the right everything. And the wrong conception of what I was trying to do. He looked at the thermometer on the east wall. "I was trying to keep the cold out. You built something that makes the question irrelevant." Elspeth looked at the torn quarters of the house plan on the corner of the table. She thought about October and the mud trap verdict and the families in the valley who were living inside structures this man had designed and built according to principles he had held with complete professional confidence. She thought about her father in the Cornish mine levels, warm at 550 feet below a winter that could not reach him, and about the specific simplicity of the principle that had produced that warmth, not fighting the cold but stepping below it, borrowing the earth's long memory of summer. "Nasi, it's not wrong." Her voice came out with a care she had not pre-planned. "What you built is good work. It was never about the construction being wrong. It was about whether the earth could be part of the solution or only part of the problem." She paused. "My father used to say that the hardest revision is the one that requires you to change the question, not just the answer." Brennan looked at her. He folded his hands around his cup. "Your father was a mining engineer." "He was. And he understood this from the mines. From the deep levels. Yes. He said the deepest shafts were always the warmest, and the warmth was not from any human effort. It was simply from going deep enough that the winter above had no reach." She looked at her own hands. "He never built one. He only told me about the principle. So I built the one I built because I had no other option." Brennan was quiet. Outside, the blizzard continued its work against the exterior of the cabin, a sound that was fully audible, but that had no thermal relationship to the space they were sitting in, which was the thing he still could not entirely reconcile with his training. The wind was there, the cold was there, and here they were at 63 degrees, drinking from warm cups while 3 young people did their schoolwork in cotton shirts. "What do you need?" His question had a different quality than his earlier questions. Not interrogative, but operative. The question of someone who has made a decision and is now determining the terms of its execution. She considered him. "Nothing I don't have. For the spring. Hey, for anyone who wants to build what you built." He looked at the torn plan. "I want to understand it properly. The framing dimensions, the intake placement, the drainage grade." He paused. "I'll need to learn it correctly before I teach anyone else." She nodded once. "Come in March when the ground begins to open up. I'll walk you through every section." He left the firewood stacked by the door. Not as charity, which both of them understood it was not, but as the concrete gesture available to a man who had driven through a blizzard carrying half a cord of seasoned oak because he needed to do something with his hands about a thing he could not fix any other way. He stepped back out into the storm. The door closed, the roar sealed off again into distance. Elspeth stood in the middle of the room for a moment before Linnea's voice pulled her back to the table. She looked at the torn house plan on the corner of the table. She left it there until evening. This is the moment everything changed. Samuel Brennan, the man who had called Elspeth's construction a grave and a mud trap, tore up his own house plans in her kitchen. Not because he was weak, because he was strong enough to recognize when he had been wrong. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit that someone they dismissed knew more than they did. Let that sit with you for a moment before we continue. The blizzard broke on January 21st. The damage tallying began immediately. in the practical way of frontier communities where assessment and recovery were not sequential but simultaneous. Livestock losses were structure failures, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from a sustained survival effort rather than an acute crisis. The statistics emerged over the following weeks: 247 dead across Dakota Territory, 12 in Ridgewood Valley alone. The Holden Ranch had lost 31 head of cattle, $4,200 in livestock, gone in 9 days. Brennan's house had suffered roof damage. 2 rooms on the second floor uninhabitable until spring repairs could be made. Josiah Oakes had lost 8 cows. The Miller family had lost their chimney to a fire on the 4th day and had sheltered with the Hendersons for the remainder of the storm. The Callaway property emerged from the worst 9 days of the winter with its livestock intact, its fuel supply at approximately 1 cord remaining, and its structures in the condition they had been in the previous October. In the 3 days following Brennan's visit, 17 people had come to shelter in the Callaway cabin. The Miller family, 5 of them, widow Henderson and her 2 grandchildren. Old Ezra Whitfield, 4 ranch hands from neighboring properties whose bunkhouses had failed. 17 people in a cabin built for 3. Linnea had cooked continuously. Soup and bread and whatever could be stretched. Tobias had maintained the animals, making the trip through the passage to the barn 3 times a day. Elspeth had explained the system to everyone who asked, and everyone asked. They sat in the warmth that the earth provided and listened to a 21-year-old woman describe principles they had never considered. And they understood. In the specific way that understanding comes when you are experiencing the thing being explained, that what she had built was not a trick or a lucky accident. It was knowledge, applied correctly. Mr. Crawford arrived on the 17th of January with his calibrated instruments in a leather case. 2 mercury thermometers that had been certified against a standard reference by a laboratory in Bismarck before the winter. A small brass device for measuring relative humidity. He spent the morning at the property with the methodical efficiency of someone conducting a formal study rather than a neighborly visit. He measured the temperature at 3 points in the passage. The barn end entrance, 44 degrees. The midpoint, 46 degrees. The cabin end entrance, 48 degrees. He measured the exterior air temperature against the barn's east wall, 19 below zero. He measured the cabin interior, 61 degrees. He sat at Elspeth's table with his instruments and her log notebook and spent close to an hour working through the data in both, his pencil moving steadily between his own notes and the pages she had kept since November. His questions were precise and technical. The framing interval dimensions, the overlap specification on the iron, the intake pipe diameter and baffle design. She answered each one with the same precision, sometimes referring to the sketches she had made during construction. When he looked up from the completed comparison, his face had the specific quality of a scientist in the moment between completing an analysis and stating its conclusions. A moment of careful internal confirmation before the professional commitment of speaking the result aloud. He opened his formal notebook to a clean page. He wrote a number, 63. Below it, he wrote the exterior temperature during the period of maximum interior reading, minus 42. He wrote the monthly wood consumption figure, 3/4 cord. He looked at what he had written. He drew a line under the 3 figures. Then he drew a second line under them, pressing the pencil down with enough force that the second line was visibly heavier than the first. He looked at Elspeth across the table. "I want to publish this." His voice had the specific quality of professional conviction, overcoming professional caution. A formal bulletin through the Territorial Extension Office. A case study format with your data and my measurements and a technical description of the construction. He paused. "I'll need you to verify the data and sign the documentation." "I'll sign it, but I want the attribution correct." He waited. "The system is my father's principal, Gareth Callaway. I built it, but the concept came from his understanding of mining engineering, the deep-level thermal principles from the Cornish operations." She met his eyes. "The bulletin should attribute the engineering principle accurately, not to me as an invention, as an application of established knowledge." Crawford made a note. He wrote without comment, which was his form of agreement. When he closed his notebook, the page that held the circled numbers was the last page of his formal documentation. In the double line under those figures was the last mark on that page. About the complaint that was filed, he said. Elspeth's face did not change. The conditions here exceed every standard the county maintains for child welfare. The complaint was baseless. He stood. I'll note that in my official report. After he left, Elspeth sat alone at the table for a long time. Copper came and put his head in her lap. She put her hand on his fur. We did it, she said quietly. We actually did it. The acknowledgments came in the days that followed, not dramatically, not in speeches or public reversals, but in the specific way that truth spreads through a small community when it can no longer be denied. Brennan came to speak with Elspeth 3 more times before the end of winter, each time with more questions. Each time with his notebook and pencil and the careful attention of a student who understood that he was learning something he should have known decades ago. I called you a fool, he said on the last visit. His voice was quiet but direct. I stood at the edge of that trench and told you that you were digging your own grave, that you were building a mud trap, that everything you were doing was wrong. He looked at the floor. I've been building for 22 years. I thought I knew what I was doing, and I was wrong. We were all wrong. Elspeth did not say anything. She let him speak. I'm sorry. The words came out heavy, the weight of a man who meant them. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I thought. And I'm sorry for the people who listened to me when they should have been listening to you. Doctor. A Fenimore Holt came the following week. His manner was different now, less confident, more inquisitive. The principles you applied, he said, they have a scientific basis. I've been researching. The thermal conductivity of soil, the frost line depth calculations, the heat exchange dynamics. He paused. I need to understand this better. For my own education. Reverend Aldous Crane came on a Sunday after services. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the thermometer and the passage door and the 3 young people who had survived the worst winter in Dakota's recorded history. Perhaps, he said slowly, God's design includes the wisdom he gives to those who pay attention to his creation. He did not apologize directly, but his presence was the apology. His willingness to see what he had refused to see before. Thaddeus Holden did not come. He sold his ranch in March, taking a significant loss on the livestock he had remaining and the property he could no longer afford to maintain. He left the valley without speaking to anyone, without acknowledging what had happened or what he had hoped would happen. Some men cannot admit they were wrong. Some men can only leave. Pause here with me for just a moment. 247 people died that winter. 3 young orphans with $4 and a borrowed pickaxe not only survived but saved 17 others who came to shelter with them. Sometimes the people everyone dismisses turn out to be the ones who see what no one else can see. Remember that. It matters. Spring came. The ground softened. The passage remained. Brennan rebuilt his house plans from scratch. In this time with a passage connecting the main building to the woodshed. This time with a modified foundation design that drew on the principles he had worked through with Elspeth over 3 sessions at her kitchen table. The resulting house was not architecturally different in any way that a casual observer would notice. The difference was in what was below grade, the way the structure met the earth rather than standing apart from it. He did not publicize the change. He simply built the house differently and let the house be its own evidence. Josiah Oakes built a version that spring, 35 feet, fieldstone for the lower walls, timber at the crown, corrugated iron for the roof. He followed Elspeth's drainage and intake specifications precisely. When the following winter arrived, his household ran at a fuel consumption 60% lower than it had managed the previous winter. He told this to 3 people before Christmas and to a dozen more by February, with the unembellished directness of a man reporting a measurement rather than a story. Old Ezra Whitfield came to Elspeth in April. He was 72 years old. He would not live to see another winter, but he sat at her table and drank her coffee and told her something she had needed to hear. I knew your father, he said. Not well, but I knew him. He came to see me once, early on, asking about my time in the Comstock, about the temperatures underground. He nodded slowly. He understood things that most people never think about, the way the earth works, the way heat moves. He was a careful man, a thinking man. He looked at her. He would have been proud of what you built, not because it saved your lives, because you understood why it worked. He died in August, quietly, in his sleep, the way men die who have made their peace with what they're leaving behind. Crawford published the bulletin in March, after the ground had begun to open and the valley had enough distance from the acute events to receive technical information with something other than raw anxiety. He titled it with the careful dryness of Extension Office prose, Geothermal Augmentation for Plains Dwellings, Principles in Construction Based on the Callaway System, Ridgewood Valley, Dakota Territory. 22 pages of clear diagrams supported technical writing describing the physics, the construction methodology, the material specifications, and the measured performance data. And it was the most thoroughly documented case study his office had ever produced. The bulletin reached 4 counties before the end of March. It reached Minnesota by May. Within 3 years, variations of the design had been built by several hundred families across the northern plains. The specific form varied with terrain and available materials. Some used stone, some timber, some a combination. But what held consistent across all of them was the essential logic. Go below the frost line, bring the Earth's thermal mass into the system, and let the winter become a factor to be managed rather than an enemy to be defeated. People called them Callaway passages in some communities, warm ways in others. The way practical things accumulate names as they spread. A journalist from Bismarck came to interview Elspeth in the summer of 1895. He was young and earnest and had prepared questions that assumed she would want to describe her work in the terms of innovation and achievement. She received him at her kitchen table and gave him coffee and answered his questions with the patience she extended to anyone who was genuinely curious. When he asked whether she was proud of what she had invented, she shook her head once. Not dismissively, but precisely. The gesture of someone correcting an inaccurate premise. She had not invented anything. The Earth had been doing what the Earth does for longer than the territory had a name. Her father had understood why it worked because the mine levels in Cornwall had made the principle physically present rather than theoretically available. She had remembered correctly and built carefully and kept an honest log, which were not minor things. She did not want to minimize them, but they were not invention. The journalist wrote down what she said, which she appreciated. He asked one more question before he left. The question people always arrived at eventually. What would she say in the simplest possible terms was the lesson of what she had built? She looked out the window at the valley, at the flat light of a July afternoon, laying itself across the grass in the particular golden way of the northern plains in summer. Warm and generous and temporary, she thought about October mornings in the trench with her breath freezing and the clay heavy on the pickaxe, about the night in December on the mound surface with 4 nails and no feeling in her right hand, about a thermometer reading 63 degrees while the world outside registered 42 below. She thought about her father at his table with a piece of newspaper and a pencil, explaining what the deep mine levels felt like. "The Earth is not your enemy," she told him. Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had proven it with numbers. "It is a resource if you ask the right question about it. We spent 50 years asking how to keep the cold out. The better question was how to bring the warmth in." She paused. "Everything else follows from that." The journalist rode back south toward town. Elspeth sat alone at the table for a moment in the kitchen of the cabin, where she had spent 9 winters since her father's death. She opened the log notebook to a fresh page. Outside temperature, July 12th, 1895, 74 degrees. Inside, 72 degrees. Wood, none. She closed the notebook and went out to check on the cattle. Copper walked beside her, slower now than he had been in the years when she was digging. His muzzle had gone gray. His joints did not bend the way they used to, but he still followed her. He still watched. He still understood when something was wrong. The morning Copper died, Elspeth knew before she opened her eyes. It was the spring of 1898. The cabin was too quiet. The space beside her bed where he had slept every night for 16 years was still occupied, but the particular warmth of him, the slight movement of his breathing, was gone. She lay there for a long time without moving. Then she got up and wrapped him in the blanket her father had brought from Cornwall, the one with the blue border that Copper had claimed as his own from the first winter in the cabin. She carried him outside. He was lighter than she remembered. Age had taken so much of him in the last year. She dug the grave beneath the oak tree, the same oak that shaded the passage entrance, the same spot where Copper had waited for her on the night she repaired the roof in 38 below. When the earth was settled, she placed a flat stone at the head of the grave. She did not carve anything on it. Anyone who needed to know what was buried there already knew. She stood for a long time, looking at the stone, at the mound behind it, at the valley stretching out toward the horizon. Copper had been there for everything: the death of her father, the discovery of the rotted wood, the weeks of digging when no one else would help, the night of the repair, the morning Brennan came to the door. All of it. And he had watched her build something that saved her family. And he had stayed until the end. In 1903, Tobias Callaway submitted his master's thesis at the University of Minnesota. He was 33 years old, an engineer, a professor, a man who had built his career on the principles his sister had taught him in a trench in Dakota when he was 16 years old. The thesis was titled Earth-Coupled Passive Heating in Plains Architecture: Principles, Construction Methods, and Measured Performance Data. In the acknowledgement section, which he wrote last and revised 3 times, he arrived at a sentence that he kept in all 3 versions because he could not find a better one. The foundational principles in this work were not taught to me in a classroom. They were demonstrated to me in the winter of 1886 to 1887 in a cabin in Ridgewood Valley by my sister, who had $4 left, a borrowed pickaxe, and a problem she could not afford to solve incorrectly. In 1912, Elspeth sat on the porch of the cabin where she had spent 26 winters. She was 47 years old. Her hair was graying at the temples. Her hands were still strong. Linnea had married a farmer from the next valley. Her lungs had never fully strengthened, but she had lived. She had 4 children. 2 of them had learned to read in this kitchen. Tobias was at the university, a respected man, a builder of things that lasted. The passage was still there. Beneath the mound of earth that had grown grass and settled and become part of the landscape in a way that made it invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. It still held 52 degrees at its center, still moved air from the barn to the cabin, still did what the earth had always been willing to do for anyone who thought to ask. In 1978, researchers from North Dakota State University came to what had once been the Callaway property. The cabin had been replaced in 1954. The barn was gone, but the passage remained. 65 feet of buried structure, still intact after 92 years. They excavated a section. They measured the temperatures. They calculated the thermal efficiency. The principles still worked. The earth still held its warmth. The numbers still said what they had always said. And that going below the frost line was not a trick or a shortcut or a violation of how things were supposed to be done. It was simply paying attention to what the earth had been offering all along. In their report, published in the Journal of Thermal Engineering, they noted, the Callaway system achieved thermal efficiency 2.3 times greater than standard construction of its era. The principles employed are consistent with modern passive house design standards and remain applicable to contemporary northern climate construction. They also noted that the original builder had been a 21-year-old woman with no formal engineering training, working alone, in conditions that modern safety standards would classify as extremely hazardous, with $4 and a borrowed pickaxe and a problem she could not afford to solve incorrectly. The passage stood for 68 years before the property changed hands, and a modern frame house replaced the original cabin. The mound disappeared gradually, frost cycles compressing and redistributing the earth over the years, the grass reclaiming its level above the iron and timber below. What remained when everything else was gone was a slight depression in the earth, a gentle, elongated channel 65 feet long, the land's memory of a passage that had been pressed into it, subtle enough that you would miss it if you were not looking, clear enough that if you knew what you were looking for, you could stand at one end and trace its full length with your eye, and understand that something had been here, going below the surface, connecting 2 points in the way that mattered. Had the summer light moved across the valley that July afternoon in 1895 the same way it had always moved, indifferent to everything it illuminated, warm on the mound of earth that ran from the cabin to the barn, warm on the woman walking toward her cattle, warm on the grass that covered the passage and would cover it for decades more. The Earth held its steady temperature below the frost line, as it always had, as it always would. Patient, constant, waiting for anyone willing to go deep enough to find it. This is where the story ends, but its lesson does not. Elspeth Calloway was 21 years old when she saved her family by remembering what her father had taught her and having the courage to act on it when everyone around her said she was wrong. The Earth is not our enemy. It is a resource if we ask the right question. The knowledge our parents and grandparents carried was not foolishness. Sometimes it was wisdom that modern people have forgotten. And sometimes, the person everyone dismisses is the one who sees what nobody else can see. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. The end.